Once a rising star in the horse world, Caleb Hayes lost everything. His family ranch, his fortune, and the stallion that meant more to him than anything. Now homeless and forgotten, fate leads him to an auction where he comes face to face with Ghost, the horse that should have never been taken from him. But winning him back won't be easy. A powerful ranch owner makes Caleb a deal: prove he's still the rider he once was, or lose Ghost forever. With ruthless rivals, buried betrayals, and a high-stakes competition standing in his way, Caleb must fight, not just for Ghost, but for his own redemption. Will he rise again, or is this his final fall? Before we dive into the full story, let us know in the comments where you're watching or listening from. Like, and don't forget to hit subscribe. Your support motivates us to share more impactful stories. The cold was merciless, the kind that crawled beneath the skin and settled deep in the bones. Wind howled through the empty streets, rattling the broken neon sign above the gas station across the road. Snowflakes drifted lazily under the glow of a flickering street lamp, landing in the creases of Caleb Hayes' coat, the tattered fabric doing little to block the winter's bite. He hunched deeper into himself, pulling his arms tighter across his chest, his breath curling in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The hunger was manageable. He had learned to live with it, but the cold was something else. It gnawed at him, relentless, a reminder that he was no longer the man he used to be. He passed a storefront where warm light glowed behind frosted glass. Inside, a family sat at a table, hands wrapped around steaming mugs, faces flushed with warmth and comfort. Caleb looked away before the sight could sink its teeth too deep into him. He had been someone once. A name that meant something in the world of horses. The son of a man whose empire stretched over acres of prime land, whose breeding stock was known in the most elite circles. His father had built something unshakable, something permanent. And then, like the brittle edges of old parchment, it had burned away. Now he was nothing but a ghost drifting from town to town, searching for something he couldn't name. Then, through the silence of falling snow, he heard it. The sharp clatter of hooves against packed dirt, the creak of a leather saddle shifting, the unmistakable rhythmic exhale of a horse in the cold. Caleb stopped. He hadn't heard those sounds up close in years. His breath hitched as his body moved on instinct, his feet carrying him down the side street, past a row of old buildings. The scent of hay, sweat, and leather wrapped around him as he neared the open lot behind a warehouse. And then he saw them. A temporary auction ring, surrounded by floodlights, illuminating the small group of buyers gathered around the wooden railing. The auctioneer stood on a raised platform, calling out bids while a handler led a broad-chested bay horse into the ring. Caleb slowed his steps, keeping to the shadows, watching the way the buyers murmured to one another, calculating, weighing the worth of the animal before them. This world had once been his. He had stood in rings like this, shaking hands with men who respected his name. Now, he wouldn't even be allowed inside. His boots crunched softly in the snow as he edged closer, staying out of sight. He told himself he didn't know why he was here. Then the next horse stepped into the ring, and the world stopped. A stallion, tall and striking, his coat black as midnight. His long mane, though tangled and dull, still carried the thickness of good breeding, and his powerful frame rippled with muscle beneath the poor condition. But Caleb's breath caught for a different reason. His eyes locked onto the stallion's left shoulder, a long, jagged scar cut through the darkness of his coat, a wound healed but never forgotten. His heart slammed against his ribs. It couldn't be. But it was. Ghost. The name caught in his throat, a memory crashing over him like an avalanche. This horse had once belonged to his father, the last stallion bred under the Hayes name. The final legacy of a bloodline that had been carefully curated, generation after generation. Ghost had been Caleb's father's proudest achievement. Strong, fearless, a horse meant for champions. And now, here he was, ragged, unwanted, being sold off like a piece of scrap metal. His blood turned to ice. The voices around him faded, the bidding starting at a pitifully low amount, as if the auctioneer was eager to be rid of him. Caleb's pulse roared in his ears. "I'll take him." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the cold like a whip. A few heads turned, and laughter rippled through the small crowd. The auctioneer barely glanced at him. "Bidding starts at 500. Caleb's stomach twisted. $500. He didn't have $5. He swallowed hard. Please. That horse! A sharp chuckle came from one of the well-dressed buyers near the front. A man with a thick scarf, his hands tucked into the pockets of an expensive coat, smirked at him. You serious, cowboy? What? You planning to pay with good intentions? More laughter followed, low and amused. Caleb clenched his fists, his heart hammering. Ghost wasn't just any horse. He was the last piece of the life Caleb had lost, the last thing that had ever meant anything. And then something happened. Ghost lifted his head. For the first time since stepping into the ring, the stallion turned slightly toward Caleb. Their eyes met. The world around him blurred into nothing. The way Ghost stood, the way his muscles tensed as he flicked his ears, the way his nostrils flared, it wasn't fear. It was recognition. Ghost remembered him. The realization struck like a blow to the chest, knocking the air from his lungs. Caleb's throat tightened. How long had Ghost waited? How many hands had he passed through? How many unfamiliar voices had called his name, tried to break him, tried to mold him into something he wasn't? Caleb had no money, no name worth anything anymore. But this was his last chance. I'll take him, Caleb said again, stronger this time. The auctioneer scoffed. If you don't have the money, you don't have the horse. Caleb opened his mouth, ready to argue, ready to beg, when another voice cut through the cold air. I'll buy him. Caleb turned sharply. A woman stood at the edge of the ring, wrapped in a sleek wool coat, her presence exuding quiet power. Dark hair pinned back, striking eyes that missed nothing. The auctioneer raised a brow. Miss Warren, you sure? That one's been passed over by half the buyers tonight. She lifted a gloved hand, signaling a bid without hesitation. I'm sure. Silence settled over the crowd. The gavel struck the podium. Sold. Caleb's stomach twisted. No. Ghost was his. He couldn't lose him again. He took a step forward, desperation clawing at his throat. Wait. The woman stopped, turning slightly, one brow raised in curiosity. Caleb swallowed hard, forcing the words out past the lump in his throat. Please, I need that horse. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. Then, after a pause, she smirked. Then prove it. The cold still clung to Caleb's skin, but it wasn't the biting wind or the snow beneath his boots that made him shiver. It was the weight of watching Ghost be led away. The knowledge that the last piece of his father's legacy, his last connection to a life that had once been his, was slipping through his fingers again. He had nothing to offer. No money, no name worth remembering, no right to ask for anything. But still, his feet carried him forward before reason could catch up. The woman, Miss Warren, they had called her, moved with an easy confidence, as though she belonged to the world of crisp dollar bills and polished leather boots. Her coat was a deep charcoal gray, cinched at the waist, the tailored wool too fine for a place like this. Everything about her spoke of someone who didn't just buy things, but owned them. And now, she owned Ghost. Caleb's pulse roared in his ears as he reached her side. Wait. She turned, one dark brow arching as her gaze swept over him. Judging, measuring. The handler beside her hesitated, Ghost's lead rope still in his hand. The stallion tossed his head, his nostrils flaring as though he too recognized Caleb standing there. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat dry. Please, I need that horse. Miss Warren tilted her head slightly, as if considering the weight of his words, but her expression remained unreadable. That's interesting, she mused, her voice smooth, almost amused. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I just bought that horse. Caleb's hands clenched at his sides, his heart hammering. She was right, of course. He had no claim. No reason for her to care. But he had to try. I know him, Caleb said, forcing the words out. I know that horse. He's not just some auction reject, not some throwaway. Caleb exhaled sharply, his pulse pounding in his ears. He belonged to my father, and he hesitated, the weight of the admission pressing against his ribs. I lost him. I lost everything. Something flickered in her dark eyes, but it was gone before he could place it. Pity? Amusement? Indifference? She regarded him for a long moment, her lips pressing together in quiet thought. Then, she sighed. That's a nice story, cowboy. Really, almost convincing. She glanced at Ghost, who was still watching Caleb, his muscles coiled with nervous energy. But that doesn't change the fact that I just paid for him. Caleb took a step closer, his fingers itching to reach out, to grasp something, anything to keep this moment from slipping away. "Please," he said again, softer this time, more raw, more desperate. Miss Warren studied him, then let out a slow breath, tapping a gloved finger against her chin as though weighing a decision that had already been made. "Tell you what," she finally said, a hint of a smirk curving her lips. "You want the horse? Prove it." Caleb blinked. "What? You heard me." She folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "You look like a man who could use a job." A cold laugh bubbled in Caleb's throat. A job he barely had the strength to stand, the hunger in his gut gnawing at his insides like a wild animal. But he forced himself to swallow his pride. If this was the only way, then so be it. "What kind of job?" he asked, voice low. Miss Warren gave a lazy shrug. "I own a ranch about 20 miles from here. Breeding stock, training, sales. I could always use an extra pair of hands." She gave him a once-over, eyes flicking over his ragged coat, his unshaven face, the wear in his boots. "You don't exactly scream reliable, but you seem to know your way around horses." Caleb's heart pounded, his throat tight. "And if I say yes?" Her smirk deepened. "Then you work for me, for as long as I see fit. If you do a good job, if you prove to me that you're worth something, then we'll talk about Ghost." Caleb knew a deal with the devil when he heard one. But what choice did he have? His fingers curled into fists, nails biting into his palms. He had fought for nothing in the past 5 years. He had let everything slip away, let himself become a ghost of the man he once was. But this he could fight for. His gaze flicked to Ghost, who was still watching him, his body tense with something just shy of hope. Caleb inhaled slowly. Exhaled. And then he nodded. "All right," he said. "You've got yourself a deal." This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Warren Ranch stretched over miles of rolling land, its pastures blanketed in freshly fallen snow, the wooden fences stretching endlessly into the distance, sturdy and unyielding against the winter wind. There was no grandeur here, no polished extravagance meant to impress. It was a place built on work, discipline, and quiet resilience, a stark contrast to the legacy Caleb had once called home. The moment he had stepped out of Olivia Warren's truck, the weight of that reality settled deep in his chest, a familiar ache pressing against his ribs. This wasn't his father's ranch. It wasn't his world. But that didn't matter, because Ghost was here. And for the first time in 5 years, so was he. The barn doors were wide open when they arrived, the early morning air sharp with the scent of hay, leather, and sweat. Horses shifted in their stalls, heads lifting to watch the new arrival with dark, intelligent eyes, steam curling from their nostrils as the warmth of their breath met the cold. Caleb took it all in. The rhythmic clatter of hooves against the stable floors, the low murmur of ranch hands exchanging quiet conversation as they worked, the sound of feed buckets being filled, the occasional soft snort of a horse tossing its head. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like walking into a life that no longer belonged to him. Olivia strode forward without looking back, her long coat flaring slightly as she moved with an effortless kind of command, the kind that came from knowing exactly where she stood in the world. Caleb followed, his boots heavy against the dirt floor, the weight of her bargain pressing against him with each step. 3 weeks. That's what she had given him. 3 weeks to prove himself. 3 weeks to prove that he wasn't just another washed-up nobody trying to claw his way back into a life that had already spit him out once. "You'll start here," Olivia said, stopping near the tack room, gesturing vaguely to the stalls lining the barn. "Mucking out, feeding, fixing anything that needs fixing. And if you last longer than a day, we'll talk about what comes next." Her words were practical, matter-of-fact, but Caleb didn't miss the warning beneath them. She wasn't offering him a job, she was offering him a fight. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the quiet hum of the barn. Well, guess we're running a charity now." Caleb turned just in time to meet the lazy, assessing gaze of Luke Carter, a tall, wiry man leaning against the stable door with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing he had nothing to lose. His light brown hair was tousled beneath his worn-out Stetson, his arms crossed over a fleece-lined jacket, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Olivia barely spared him a glance. "Luke, meet Caleb Hayes. He's going to be working with us for a while." Luke's smirk widened. "Oh, is that right?" He pushed off the stable door with an easy, fluid motion, taking a slow step closer. "Didn't think we were in the business of handouts, boss." Caleb didn't react. He had met men like Luke before, men who looked for weakness, the way wolves scented blood in the air. "I'm not here for a handout," Caleb said, his voice even. Luke tilted his head as if considering that for a moment before letting out a low chuckle. "Well, that's a relief. Would hate to think we're wasting good feed on someone who won't last past sunrise." Olivia sighed, rubbing her temple as though she had neither the time nor the patience for Luke's antics. "Are you done?" Luke grinned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, for now." Then he turned on his heel and walked off, disappearing into the tack room without another word. Caleb exhaled, steadying himself. He didn't have time for this. "Don't let him get to you," Olivia said, her voice quieter now, more measured. "Luke's been with me for years. He doesn't take kindly to new faces." Caleb scoffed, shaking his head. "That's funny, because from where I'm standing, he seemed plenty interested in me." Olivia didn't argue. Instead, she nodded toward the row of stalls. "Get to work." Caleb had spent years on his father's ranch, years learning every inch of the land, every detail of the business, every subtle cue a horse could give if a man only knew how to listen. But it had been a long time since he had worked like this. By midday, his muscles burned, his shoulders ached, and his fingers were raw from gripping the wooden handles of the pitchfork, the shovel, the ropes. He moved through the tasks methodically, refusing to let exhaustion take hold, refusing to give Luke or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Muck out the stalls. Haul the feed. Repair the fencing. Don't stop. Don't slow down. Don't think. He had spent the last 5 years doing nothing. Now he would make up for every wasted second. And yet, through it all, he felt the weight of another gaze on him. Ghost's stall was at the far end of the barn, one of the larger enclosures, its heavy wooden door marked with the deep grooves of restless hooves. Caleb could see him through the half-open gate, the stallion standing tall, muscles coiled beneath his sleek black coat, his ears flicking at the distant sounds of the ranch. But it was his eyes that held Caleb's attention. Dark, watchful, waiting. Ghost had been passed from hand to hand, had been pushed and pulled by strangers who didn't understand him, didn't care about him, didn't see him for what he was. And yet, here he was. Just like Caleb. That night, long after the barn had gone quiet, Caleb found himself standing in front of Ghost's stall, hands resting on the top rail, his breath curling in the cold air. Ghost flicked his ears but didn't turn away. "I didn't know where you were," Caleb murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The stallion exhaled softly, shifting his weight but never breaking his gaze. "I should have fought harder," Caleb admitted, his chest tightening. "I should have." He shook his head, pressing his lips together. It didn't matter now. What mattered was this moment. What mattered was that Ghost was here. The stallion lowered his head slightly, his ears flicking forward. Recognition. Not trust. Not yet. But something close. Caleb exhaled, stepping back from the stall. Not yet, but soon. The sky had begun to shift from the dull gray of early morning to something lighter, something softer. The wind had lost its bite, but the crispness of winter still clung to the air, wrapping around the Warren ranch like a quiet promise. The horses were already stirring in their stalls, their soft knickers and shifting hooves filling the barn with a familiar rhythm, the kind that Caleb hadn't realized he had missed until now. It had been a week since he arrived. 7 days of brutal labor. 7 days of pushing his body past the limits of exhaustion, of ignoring the aches in his muscles, the stiffness in his joints, the rawness of his hands. 7 days of Luke's taunting smirks, of Olivia's watchful gaze, of knowing that Ghost was right there, so close yet still untouchable. But today, that would change. Today, he would ride again. He had been mucking out the last of the stalls when Olivia's voice cut through the quiet. "You're up, cowboy." Caleb turned, brushing the back of his hand across his forehead. Olivia stood near the stable doors, arms crossed, dark eyes unreadable. He wiped his hands on his jeans, straightening. "For what?" Olivia's lips quirked slightly. "Your test." Something cold settled in Caleb's stomach, but he didn't let it show. He had known this was coming, had been waiting for it. She tilted her chin toward the paddock beyond the barn. "Let's see if you're still worth anything in the saddle." A quiet murmur passed through the few stable hands nearby. Even Luke, who had been brushing down one of the geldings, turned just enough to watch, amusement flickering behind his lazy grin. "Well?" Luke mused, shaking out his rag. "This ought to be good." Caleb ignored him. He followed Olivia outside, stepping onto the packed snow just as the ranch hand brought a horse into the training ring. A bay gelding, well-muscled but restless, his ears twitching as he was led toward the mounting block. Not Ghost. Caleb knew better than to show his disappointment. The gelding shifted under the reins, tossing his head slightly, but Olivia simply raised a brow. "Problem? No." Caleb rolled his shoulders, forcing himself to focus. This wasn't about Ghost. Not yet. This was about proving that he was more than just a washed-up failure, clinging to a past that no longer belonged to him. He stepped forward, one hand resting briefly against the horse's shoulder, before he grabbed the saddle horn and pulled himself up in a single, fluid motion. And just like that, he was back in the saddle. The moment his body settled, the world around him shifted. It was muscle memory, the way his legs fit against the sides of the horse, the way his hands instinctively found the reins, the way he adjusted his posture without thinking. The stiffness in his joints screamed at him, but he ignored it, focused on the quiet, steady rhythm of the animal beneath him. The gelding pranced slightly, testing him, but Caleb barely moved, barely reacted. He knew this dance. He had lived it, breathed it. And God, how had he ever stayed away? "You remember how to ride?" Olivia said, leaning against the fence, arms still crossed. "That's a start." Luke made a humming noise from behind her. "Sure, but let's see if he remembers how to stay on." Caleb didn't have time to register the warning before it happened. The gelding bucked hard, twisting violently beneath him, muscles coiling like a spring. The cold air whipped past Caleb's face as the ground seemed to tilt, the force of the movement threatening to throw him, to send him sprawling into the dirt like a fool. Luke's laugh was sharp and immediate. But Caleb didn't fall. His body moved before his mind could catch up, instincts kicking in as he shifted his weight, tightened his knees, pulled back on the reins just enough to guide the horse back into control. It took seconds, just seconds, but by the time the gelding stopped, breath heaving, Caleb was still there, still upright, still in command. The laughter died. Silence stretched across the ring, broken only by the sound of the horse's heavy breathing. Caleb exhaled slowly, releasing the tension in his grip. Then he turned toward Luke, who had gone strangely quiet. "Something funny?" Caleb asked. Luke's smirk had flattened into something else, something tighter. But before he could answer, Olivia stepped forward, her voice unreadable. "Get off." Caleb hesitated. "You proved your point," Olivia said. "Now get off." Carefully, Caleb swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, his boots crunching against the frozen dirt. Olivia studied him for a long moment. Then, to his complete and utter surprise, she said, "Ghost, tomorrow." His stomach twisted. "What?" "You get one chance," Olivia said simply. "One ride. You mess it up, you don't get another." Caleb didn't hesitate. "I won't mess it up." Olivia nodded once before turning on her heel and walking away. Luke let out a low whistle. "Well, that's unfortunate." Caleb glanced at him. "What is?" Luke's grin was slow and taunting. "That horse don't let nobody ride him." Caleb's fingers curled at his sides. Tomorrow, one chance, and he'd be damned if he wasted it. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning was sharper than usual, the cold carrying an edge that cut through the layers of Caleb's worn jacket as he stepped out of the barn. The sky was pale, washed out, the kind of winter morning where time seemed to stretch, where the world held its breath before something happened. And today, something was going to happen. Caleb had been up before dawn, lying awake in the small bunkhouse Olivia had given him, staring at the ceiling, feeling every beat of his pulse like the ticking of a countdown clock. This was it, his one chance. He had survived the week of grueling work, endured Luke's smirks and Olivia's tests, and now it was time to face the moment that had haunted him since the night he saw Ghost in the auction ring. Today, he would ride him. But that was assuming Ghost let him anywhere near the saddle. The barn was already alive with morning chores, the stable hands moving with quiet efficiency, the scent of fresh hay and grain heavy in the air. Caleb ignored them all. His focus honed in on one thing, the stall at the far end where Ghost stood, waiting. The stallion watched him approach, his dark eyes unreadable beneath the thick curtain of his forelock. He was sleek, powerful, a beast carved from midnight and shadows, but there was something wary in the way he held himself. Something that warned Caleb this would not be easy. He stopped, just outside the stall door, resting his hands against the wood, letting Ghost see him, letting the stallion make the first move. Ghost flicked an ear, shifting slightly, but he didn't turn away. It was something. "Morning, old man," Caleb murmured, his voice low, familiar. The way he used to talk to him years ago, when Ghost had been just a young colt learning the rhythm of the land beneath his hooves. "You remember me, don't you?" Ghost didn't answer, of course, but he also didn't back away. That was all Caleb needed. He unlatched the stall door, moving slow, careful, because trust was something built in moments, in patience, in knowing when to move and when to wait. He stepped inside, let Ghost catch his scent, let him understand that he wasn't here to take anything, wasn't here to break him the way others had tried. The stallion's muscles twitched beneath his coat, a flicker of instinct telling him to retreat, but he didn't. Caleb reached out, one slow, steady motion, his fingers brushing against Ghost's neck, feeling the warmth of his skin, the powerful heartbeat beneath. A connection. Faint, fleeting, but there. Outside the stall, Olivia and Luke were watching. "Not bad," Olivia remarked, her tone giving nothing away. Luke snorted. "He got close, that's all. Wait till he tries to get a saddle on him." Caleb ignored them both. This wasn't about them. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about Ghost. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady. "All right, boy, let's see what you remember." The moment the saddle came into view, Ghost reacted. His ears flattened, his body tensed, and before Caleb could blink, the stallion was moving. A sharp pivot, powerful muscles twisting as he bucked against the stall door, nostrils flaring, hooves striking against the wood with a force that rattled the entire barn. Caleb didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't fight back. He let Ghost run through it, let the fear work its way through him, because that's what this was, fear. Not defiance, not stubbornness, just the remnants of too many hands forcing him into submission, too many unfamiliar voices demanding control. "Damn," Luke muttered, shaking his head. "Told you." But Caleb wasn't done. Slowly, deliberately he stepped back, setting the saddle down just outside the stall. Then he lowered himself to the ground, sitting, resting his arms on his knees, making himself small, making himself not a threat. Ghost snorted, pacing the length of the stall, his body still coiled, still ready for war. But he flicked an ear toward Caleb, then another, the whites of his eyes no longer visible. Caleb waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15. The other hands had stopped their work now, watching, whispering among themselves. But Caleb didn't care. He stayed. And finally, Ghost stopped pacing. He exhaled, long and slow, the fight draining out of him, the tension slipping from his muscles. His head lowered, just slightly, just enough. And Caleb knew he had won the first battle. The next part wasn't easy. The saddle wasn't the enemy, it was what it represented. Caleb didn't rush, didn't demand. He worked slow, letting Ghost see every movement, touching him first without expectation, giving him the choice. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the saddle settled into place. No reaction. Caleb tightened the cinch. No fight. And when he finally led Ghost out into the open paddock, the crisp winter air wrapping around them both, the stallion walked beside him, not behind, not ahead, but beside. Luke muttered something under his breath, but Olivia? She just watched, waiting, testing. Caleb took a deep breath and placed his hand on the saddle horn. This was it. Everything hinged on this moment. He swung up, settling into the saddle in one smooth motion, his hands finding the reins like they had never left them. For a heartbeat, Ghost stood still. The world around them seemed to pause, the barn hands frozen where they stood. Luke's smirk fading, Olivia's eyes sharpening. And then, Ghost moved. A slow step, then another. And then they were gliding across the paddock, as if 5 years had never passed, as if this was exactly where they were supposed to be. Caleb exhaled, a deep, bone-deep breath that he hadn't even realized he was holding. Ghost trusted him, and for the first time in 5 years, Caleb trusted himself, too. The morning after the ride with Ghost, Caleb expected something to shift. He had earned that moment in the saddle, had felt the trust begin to settle between them. Fragile but real. He thought maybe, just maybe, Olivia would finally see him as more than a washed-up failure, more than a desperate man grasping at the remnants of his past. Instead, when he walked into the barn at dawn, Luke was already waiting for him. The stable was quiet, save for the familiar rustling of hay and the occasional stomp of a hoof against wood. Dust swirled in the golden shafts of light filtering through the half-open doors, giving the place an almost peaceful stillness. But Luke's grin ruined the illusion. "Well, well," he drawled, leaning against a stall door, arms folded across his chest. "Look at you, cowboy, still standing." Caleb ignored him, grabbing the worn leather lead hanging near Ghost's stall. Luke wasn't finished. "Gotta admit, I didn't think you'd last the first week." He pushed off the wall, boots scuffing against the floorboards as he moved closer. "Figured you'd be limping out of here with your tail tucked between your legs by now, but hell, you actually got on the beast." Caleb kept his grip loose on the lead rope, kept his face unreadable. He knew the game Luke was playing. Push, poke, needle him until he snapped. Not today. "I did," he said simply. Luke smirked. "Sure did. Question is, can you do it again?" Caleb turned to face him fully then, taking in the sharpness of his eyes, the challenge sitting just beneath the easy arrogance in his smirk. Luke wasn't just taunting him. He was setting something up. Olivia's voice cut through the tension before Caleb could reply. "Enough." She strode into the barn like she owned every inch of it. Because she did. Dark hair tucked beneath a cream-colored scarf, her sharp gaze flicked between the two of them, assessing. Always watching, always calculating. Luke took a step back, but not before flashing Caleb a grin. "Just having a friendly chat, boss." Olivia didn't buy it for a second, but she didn't press. Instead, she turned her attention to Caleb. "Ghost is yours for training now." The words landed heavy, final. Caleb barely had time to process them before she kept going. "You'll ride him every day. Work with him. Earn him. Because in 2 weeks, I'm entering you both in the Winter Ridge competition." Caleb's breath hitched, just for a second. Luke let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "You're kidding, right?" Olivia wasn't. She turned toward Caleb, unreadable as ever. "You said you wanted him. This is your shot to prove you deserve him." Luke laughed under his breath. "This ought to be fun." Caleb clenched his jaw. 2 weeks. That wasn't enough time. Not for a horse that had been passed between strangers, not for a stallion that had forgotten what trust was supposed to feel like. But Caleb didn't argue. He didn't hesitate, because he wasn't going to lose Ghost again. The rest of the day moved in fragments, Ghost's breathing steady beneath Caleb's touch, the scent of leather and sweat as he adjusted the saddle, the feeling of raw muscle coiling and tensing beneath him as Ghost tested the limits of his own body. And through it all, he could feel Luke watching. Waiting. He had seen it before, in men who hated being outshined, outdone, outworked. Luke wasn't just waiting for Caleb to fail, he was planning for it. And it came to a head that afternoon. Caleb had Ghost in the training paddock, working on trust, connection, rhythm. The stallion was still guarded, still hesitant in the way he responded to the slightest shift in pressure. But he was listening. Trying. Then, just as Caleb guided him toward the second jump in the course Olivia had set up, it happened, a sudden, sharp noise, a metallic clank, loud, deliberate. Ghost reacted instantly. His body went rigid, his muscles locking, panic flashing across his dark eyes. And then he bucked. Caleb didn't have time to think, only to react, only to grip the reins tighter, shift his weight, try to guide Ghost back down before. The ground hit him hard. A sharp, punishing impact that knocked the breath from his lungs, leaving him momentarily stunned as the cold of the snow seeped through his jacket, biting into his skin. Ghost wheeled back, eyes wild, nostrils flaring. Caleb barely had time to register the pain before Luke's laugh sliced through the quiet. "Well, damn," he mused from where he stood near the barn doors, arms still crossed, that same cocky grin still plastered on his face. "Guess even legends hit the ground, huh?" Caleb knew. Knew Luke had caused the noise. Knew it was calculated, timed, meant to rattle Ghost just enough. Slowly, Caleb pushed himself up, gritting his teeth against the stiffness settling into his ribs. Ghost was still breathing hard, ears flicking in every direction, the fear still too close, too familiar. Caleb moved toward him carefully, ignoring the dull ache pulsing through his body. He let out a slow breath, just enough to show Ghost there was nothing to run from. Nothing to fear. The stallion's ears twitched. He shifted his weight, still hesitant, still watching Caleb like he was waiting for something. And then finally he stepped closer. Just a fraction. But it was enough. Caleb reached out, his hands steady, his fingers pressing lightly against Ghost's shoulder. "We're okay," he murmured. "We're okay." Luke's amusement dimmed slightly, as if he had expected Caleb to quit, expected Ghost to bolt. But Caleb wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. Later that evening, after the barn had settled, Caleb found Luke near the paddock, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Caleb didn't waste time. "You don't like me?" "Fine," he said, voice quiet but firm. "But you don't mess with my horse." Luke tilted his head, his grin sharp, amused. "Your horse?" Caleb's fingers twitched. "Yeah." Luke let the silence stretch before exhaling, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you?" Caleb frowned. "This isn't about you," Luke said. "It's about her." For the first time, something cold settled in Caleb's chest. Luke smirked. "You really think Olivia's doing this out of the kindness of her heart?" He took a slow step forward. "You think she's betting on you because she believes in redemption stories?" Caleb didn't answer. Because for the first time, he didn't know what to say. Luke's grin widened. "You're just a pawn in whatever game she's playing." He patted Caleb's shoulder once, condescending. "Good luck, cowboy." Then he walked off, leaving Caleb standing in the cold, Ghost's breath warm against his skin, the doubt settling deep in his chest. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The barn was quieter than usual that night. The usual shuffle of hooves, the soft rustle of hay, the quiet murmurs of stable hands finishing their evening routines had faded, leaving only the occasional creak of the rafters as the cold settled deeper into the bones of the ranch. Caleb stood near Ghost's stall, absently brushing the stallion's dark coat, though his mind was nowhere near the task at hand. His thoughts were tangled, looping back to Luke's words. The smirk, the way he had spoken like a man who knew something Caleb didn't. "You really think Olivia's doing this out of the kindness of her heart?" Caleb had never been naive, never been the kind of man to take generosity at face value. But this had gotten under his skin. And he needed answers. Ghost exhaled a slow, steady breath, his massive frame shifting under Caleb's touch, ears flicking lazily as though sensing the unease curling inside his rider. Caleb gave him one last firm brush before setting the tool down, exhaling as he straightened. He had been playing by Olivia's rules, taking the work, proving himself, waiting for the moment he could finally claim Ghost as his own. But now, he wanted to know what game he was actually playing. Olivia's office was small but efficient, tucked away at the far end of the ranch house. There were no unnecessary decorations, no sentimental keepsakes cluttering the space, just a desk covered in neatly stacked paperwork, a few framed awards hanging on the walls, and the lingering scent of fresh coffee. She looked up the moment he stepped in, as if she had been expecting him. "You look like a man with something on his mind," she said, leaning back in her chair, studying him with that same cool, unreadable gaze. Caleb didn't waste time. "What is this really about?" Olivia didn't blink. "Be more specific." Caleb took a slow step forward, resting his hands on the back of the leather chair opposite her desk, not sitting, not relaxing. "Luke's got a lot to say about why I'm here. Seems to think I'm not just working for Ghost, I'm part of something else, some play you're making." Something flickered across her expression, so fast Caleb almost missed it. But it was there. Not surprise, not confusion, something closer to calculation. She exhaled, tapping her fingers once against the desk before pushing to her feet. "You're not stupid, Caleb. You know I don't do charity work." Caleb held her gaze. "So what is this then? A favor? A bet?" Olivia studied him for a long moment, then walked toward the window, looking out over the ranch, her arms folded across her chest. The moon cast a pale glow over the fields, the fences stretching like dark lines across the white landscape. Finally, she spoke. "My father built this place," she said quietly, "from nothing. He wasn't a man of wealth, not at first. He earned this, built it with his own hands, his own sweat, his own instincts, and I watched him fight for it every damn day." Caleb didn't move, didn't speak. "He had one rule," Olivia continued, her voice distant. "One simple rule that kept this ranch running. You back the right horse. Always." She turned then, finally looking at Caleb again, and this time there was no distance in her eyes. "I see talent," she said. "I see a man who knew horses before he knew how to walk. And I see a man who lost everything, not because he wasn't good enough, but because someone else played the game better. And I don't like seeing good talent go to waste." The words landed heavy between them, solid and final. Caleb's jaw tightened. "So this is an investment?" Olivia nodded once. "Yes, I want a return, and I think you can give it to me." Caleb let out a slow breath, turning the words over in his mind. It made sense. It was logical. But there was something else, something unspoken sitting just beneath her explanation, something she hadn't said outright. "You want more than that," he said, watching her carefully. "You want to win." Olivia's lips curved slightly, but it wasn't amusement. It was something colder, something closer to truth. "I always want to win, Caleb." Silence stretched between them, thick and weighted. Caleb had spent years being a fool, trusting the wrong people, betting on things that never paid off. And yet here he was, staring at a woman who had laid her cards on the table, who wasn't pretending to be anything she wasn't. She was ruthless, calculated, sharp, but she hadn't lied. And for the first time in a long time, Caleb could respect that. He nodded once. "All right." Olivia arched a brow. "All right, what?" "I'll ride for you," Caleb said. "I'll win this competition, and when I do, Ghost is mine." Olivia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was genuine in its own way. "Deal." She held out a hand. Caleb took it. And just like that, they were in business. The days blurred into a cycle of cold mornings, grueling rides, and the steady rhythm of hooves against the frozen ground. The Warren Ranch became a battlefield of discipline and endurance, and at the center of it all was Caleb and Ghost. The first few rides were brutal. Ghost was powerful but unpredictable, still carrying the tension of years spent in uncertain hands, still unsure of who to trust. Caleb had to earn every step, every movement, every flicker of confidence. But little by little, the stallion began to remember. Not just the feel of a rider who understood him, but the old patterns, the language between horse and man that had once been second nature. Caleb had always believed that riding wasn't about control. It was about communication, trust, a silent agreement between two beings who needed each other to move forward. And every day, they moved forward. Olivia was relentless. Every morning, she was there, watching, correcting, pushing. She didn't offer praise, didn't coddle him, didn't allow for second chances. "You hesitate, you lose," she reminded him after a particularly difficult run. Ghost had refused the last jump, his muscles locking up, his trust faltering at the last second. Caleb had nearly been thrown. "I didn't hesitate," Caleb muttered, shaking out the tension in his arms. Olivia's gaze was sharp. "Maybe not in your body, but in your head? You're still carrying doubt, Caleb. He feels it. And the moment you stop believing in him, he stops believing in you." Caleb exhaled, nodding once. She wasn't wrong. Every ride was more than just training. It was a fight against ghosts, against fear, against the past that still clung to him like a shadow. And there was no room for shadows in the arena. It happened 3 days before the competition. Caleb had spent the morning running Ghost through drills, sharpening their movements, building their confidence. The stallion was stronger, faster, more sure of himself than ever before. They were finally ready, but Luke wasn't about to let that happen. Caleb had just finished unsaddling Ghost, his muscles aching from the morning ride, when Olivia approached with an unreadable expression. "Ghost's paperwork is missing." Caleb frowned. "What?" Olivia's voice was tight. "The entry form, the ownership verification, everything. It was on my desk last night. Now it's gone." The meaning hit Caleb like a blow. No paperwork, no entry, no competition. His pulse roared in his ears. He didn't need to ask who was responsible. Luke had always played dirty. But this was war. Caleb didn't hesitate. "I'll find it." Olivia didn't stop him. The ranch was quiet as night fell, but Caleb wasn't interested in sleep. He had searched the entire office, gone through every folder, every drawer. The papers were nowhere to be found, which meant one thing: Luke had them. And Caleb knew exactly where to find him. The old feed shed sat on the edge of the property, just past the training paddock, where the night was darkest, where conversations weren't meant to be overheard. Caleb didn't bother with caution. He pushed the door open hard, stepping inside, cold fury burning in his chest. Luke didn't look surprised. He was leaning against a stack of hay bales, arms folded, his signature smirk already in place. "Guessing you came for this?" Luke said casually, holding up a worn envelope. Caleb clenched his jaw. "Hand it over." Luke sighed, turning the envelope over in his fingers. "You ever wonder why Olivia's so invested in you? Why she's willing to put her name, her money, her reputation on the line for some washed-up cowboy who lost his place in the world?" Caleb didn't bite. "I don't care what you think you know." Luke chuckled. "Sure you do, you just don't want to hear it." He tilted his head. "This isn't just about you, Hayes. You're a bet, a gamble. She's got something riding on this, and when people like Olivia gamble, they don't like to lose." Caleb's fingers twitched, but his voice stayed steady. "You don't get to decide that." Luke sighed, shaking his head. "You're missing the point." Then, without warning, he tossed the envelope into the air, the contents spilling out, papers fluttering like broken wings before hitting the dirt floor. Caleb's stomach clenched. For a split second he saw red. But he didn't move, didn't lash out, didn't give Luke what he wanted. Instead, he crouched, gathering the papers one by one, dusting them off, steady hands betraying none of the rage boiling beneath his skin. Luke watched, his smirk flickering just slightly, as though he had been expecting something else. "Still the good little soldier," he mused. Caleb tucked the papers back into the envelope, exhaling slowly, steadying the fire in his chest. Then he met Luke's gaze and smiled. Cold, sharp, certain. "I'll see you in the arena." Then he turned and walked away, Ghost's name secure, his fate still his own. The air at Winter Ridge was sharp, the cold biting but electric, charged with the weight of competition, expectation, and something that felt like destiny. The arena loomed ahead, banners fluttering against the icy wind, the stands filling with spectators bundled in heavy coats, their breath curling in the winter air. This was it. This was what everything had led to. The long nights, the bruised ribs, the battles fought in silence, the slow and steady rebuilding of trust between a man and a horse that had once been lost to each other. Caleb stood beside Ghost in the warm-up paddock, his gloved fingers resting against the stallion's sleek black coat, feeling the heartbeat beneath his palm, the raw strength that pulsed there, waiting. 2 weeks ago, Ghost wouldn't have let anyone near him. Now, they were in this together. A quiet footstep behind him made Caleb glance up. Olivia. She was dressed in her usual elegance, long wool coat, dark gloves, her hair pinned back beneath a fitted riding cap. But there was something different about her today, something softer. "You ready?" she asked. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Yeah." She studied him, her gaze lingering a beat longer than necessary. "You win this, and Ghost is yours." He nodded. "I know." Another pause. Then, just as he turned back toward the horse, she said, "And if you lose?" He looked at her again. Heart steady. "I won't." And for the first time since he'd met her, Olivia smiled. The competition was set up in rounds. The course was brutal. High, technical jumps, tight turns, the kind that required absolute trust between rider and horse. And for the first time, Caleb wasn't just fighting for Ghost, he was fighting against Luke. Luke had entered the competition, and when Caleb caught sight of him from across the warm-up ring, the other man smirked, adjusting the gloves on his hands. "Still standing, cowboy?" Caleb met his gaze, steady. "Wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Luke chuckled, swinging into the saddle. "Then let's see what you've got." The announcer called the riders to the starting gate. Caleb took a deep breath, steadied himself. Then with one smooth motion he swung up onto Ghost's back. The stallion shifted beneath him, ears flicking forward, his body taut with energy, waiting for Caleb's signal, waiting for permission to fly. Luke rode first. His horse was fast, precise, but cold, mechanical. The kind of precision that came from technical skill, not heart. He cleared the final jump clean, and the crowd roared. Caleb didn't hear them, because the second Luke crossed the finish line, Caleb was moving. Ghost surged forward, and they were off. The wind ripped through Caleb's coat, the world blurring into motion as the first jump approached. He barely had to cue Ghost. The stallion knew, felt, understood. They moved as one, gliding over the rail, landing smooth, gaining speed. The turns came fast, the jumps tighter, the obstacles higher. Caleb didn't hesitate, he didn't think, he trusted. And so did Ghost. The crowd gasped as they cleared the final stretch, a triple set of jumps, unforgiving in height and distance. Caleb felt Ghost gather beneath him, muscles coiling. And then, They flew. The last jump was a blur, the landing smooth, then silence. Then the roar of the crowd. The time flashed on the scoreboard faster, by half a second. Luke stared from across the arena, his smirk gone. Caleb exhaled. It was over. They had won. The celebration was a blur. Olivia was there at the edge of the paddock, watching him with something unreadable in her eyes. When he dismounted, she stepped forward. "You did it," Caleb nodded, reaching up to pat Ghost's neck. "We did." A beat of silence. Then, softly, Olivia said, "He's yours." Caleb looked at her, something shifting between them. Something that had nothing to do with contracts or business. He nodded. "I know." She hesitated then, as if making a decision. She said, "Come inside when you're ready. We should talk." Then she was gone. Caleb exhaled, looking back at Ghost. The stallion flicked an ear, nudging his shoulder. Caleb smiled. Yeah, it was time for new beginnings. Later that evening, when the lights had dimmed and the crowd had gone, Caleb swung into the saddle one last time that day, guiding Ghost toward the open pastures. The land stretched ahead, untouched, silent beneath the moonlight. And together they ran, fast, free, exactly as they were always meant to be. Thank you for listening. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more captivating stories coming your way tomorrow.